كلام في التصميم هو بودكاست من تقديم ليوان يستكشف مواضيع التصميم المعاصر في الشرق الأوسط وخارجه، ويربط أصوات المصممين المبدعين المحليين مع العالميين لتشجيع التعاون ومناقشة الأمور الإبداعية والثقافية والفكرية.
Talks on Design podcast by Liwan explores contemporary design themes across the Middle East and beyond. Featuring pioneering Qatari creatives, the podcast connects local and global design voices and encourages collaboration and commentary on creative, cultural, and intellectual matters.
Hi, Yasmeen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being on this conversation with me today. I'm so excited. You and I have had many conversations about fashion, textile, design, production, all of these things. But I'm really excited to dive into particularly how archiving plays a role in all of this today with you. Can you tell me a little bit just about yourself for some context on what you do and who you are?
Yeah, of course. I'm a Palestinian American raised between Palestine and the US most of my life before I moved to be permanently based in Ramallah 7 years ago. I'm the creative director and founder of Nod Collective, and we work with artisans, producers, tailors all over Palestine, Ramallah to Al-Khalil, Gaza, and Quds, some of whom we'll be talking about today.
Beautiful. I'm Yasmeen Ahram. Also, I'm a Palestinian and Lebanese. I'm a designer at Studio Safar and researcher, as well as a writer. And as I said today, we're going to be talking about textiles and fashion, which have been incredibly useful archival tools, hosting a deep well of knowledge on our societies and our histories, globally, regionally, but especially as Palestinians, from the meaning of different types of embroidery to the significance of certain silhouettes, beyond just the beautiful aesthetic value of these elements, fashion and textile design have been a mode of communication and a weaver of community. And something that you have shown a light on through your work is that the deeper we dive into threads and textile, the more is revealed to us. So I guess through our conversation, I'm curious to uncover some of these layers with you today. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about the role of textile design in culture and community.
Well, you're absolutely right about the fact that when we look more deeply at a textile or a craft, that we start uncovering more. And I mean, in Palestinian context, we start learning more about the political history, the political connotations of a fabric, the way that a fabric has this metamorphosis over time because of military occupation, fabric and embroidery. And the first thing that comes to my mind is always Mjalli fabric, which, go ahead.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Mjalli fabric, especially for those that may be unfamiliar?
This fabric changed my life. This fabric it might seem simple at first. It's like 40 to 60 centimeters wide, which when you're working with fabric and fashion is ridiculous. It's so difficult. You need way more than 60 centimeters width of fabric to be able to produce something. It's got a basic base, so usually black, navy, and then it has beautiful, vivid stripes on the side of it. So usually fuchsia and turquoise. And we also call it heaven and hell. This fabric is named for its namesake village, Al-Majdal, which if you try and find it on the map today, you're not going to find it. It was depopulated and then razed to the ground by Zionist forces in 1948. And the weavers who used to make this fabric by hand on the loom were displaced. So they went all over Urdun, they went to Gaza. And today, the weavers who keep alive this craft, a handful of weavers, they're not that many, they're based in Gaza. So when you're looking at this fabric, you're like, wow, this fabric exists in the face of attempted erasure. It wasn't being produced for decades before these weavers revived it in the 90s. So this fabric is like the epitome of what it means to peel back the layers of something, of specifically something in fashion, and understand the political, social connotations and the idea that it's an act of resistance to keep producing it, especially today in what's happening with Gaza right now.
Mm-hmm. What was your introduction to Majdalawi fabric? What was your first interaction with it?
Well, okay, so it all goes back to a photo, and I've talked about this photo so many times. I'm a broken record, but I love this photo. It did this particular photo changed the trajectory of my life. It's a photo of this man on the beach in Gaza sometime in the 1970s, a photo made by Thomas Abercrombie. It was an assignment for Nat Geo, but it never got published. And that's why when they were released a few years ago and posted on Instagram, it was kind of a shock because everyone in the comments was like, what is this guy doing? No one really could understand what he was doing. It was so strange to Palestinians, even, not just like anyone in 2023 looking at these photos. He was on the beach and he had like dozens and dozens and dozens of skeins of yarn, like in different colors, yellow, red, blue, just scattered around him, reaching to the point where the water is on the sand. And you're like, what is this guy doing? It turns out in the comments that people crowdsourced the information, but he'd been washing the skeins in the salt water because the salt of the water would fix the color to the yarn. And then it would be used for weaving, which is tied to Gaza's rich history of weaving. So I was like, okay, I need to know more about this. So I started doing like insane amounts of research, like Gaza, weaving, natural dyeing all over Palestine. And that's what led me to Majdalawi.
Beautiful. This sort of connection to these historically significant fabrics came later on in your work as a designer and a creative director. And what's interesting is that typically when we think of archives, it's something that has existed in our past, right? We see it as something that is sort of stuck in a period of time with which we found it, when really everything that we do in our present is building a live archive of our existence, and in this case, our resistance. So I wanted to ask you, of course, other than incorporating these fabrics in your design work and your textile design, how do we honor and maybe even contemporize or evolve a textile that has this significance while trying to preserve its historical, environmental, and sociopolitical context?
Well, really quickly, I just want to say maybe I need to clarify about what fixing the color means. Fixing the color in natural dyeing means that the natural dye that's used on the yarn doesn't wash out. So by fixing it, you're making it more permanent. And so the salt acts as an agent to be able to fix the color. But talking about the archiving, it's interesting. There are a couple of weavers that I worked with in Gaza, and one of them is so strict about producing the exact colorways and the exact patterns that have been used for generations. And so they're very strict. And then there's another workshop that I work with that is experimenting with different colorways, different patterns. And they're like, what? They're pushing the envelope a little bit more, and they're not as strict about preserving the colorways that we have seen in photographs of Palestinian thawab. Thawab is a Palestinian dress for generations. So I don't know. It's a bit of a difficult question, I think, because by working with both of them and telling both of their stories, I guess you're doing a little bit of both, honoring both both desires to be strict with tradition and then the idea that you want to explore and try something new within the confines of, not the confines, but the parameters of the traditional craft of weaving. So by using the same tools, using the same wooden loom, doing it by hand, doing it in the same style, but experimenting in other parts of the fabric.
Yeah. I want to go back to that image because something that's interesting is that you mentioned you found it on Instagram. And a lot of our sort of archives were either destroyed or are being held from us, and we don't have access to these. And so I'm wondering, the question of accessibility, right, and access to our archives and fabrics and even our practices, indigenous practices of treating the fabric, natural dyes, and all of these things. I'm curious as to what are the obstacles that you've faced in the process of learning about and trying to archive a textile yourself through your work.
That's such a good question. I love this question. It was really difficult. So Palestinians, for a couple of reasons, we don't know the exact natural dyeing techniques that would have been used in like the late 19th century before, chemical dyes were introduced, and then before eventually it just stopped altogether and we started importing fabrics. We don't know for a couple of reasons. One, we just had an oral history. And then two, a lot of the families that made up the industry of natural dyeing in Palestine had secret recipes. So every family had their own recipe, and I guess they dyed with the dyers. There's no record that I have found in Arabic or English that is archived the recipes. And so the couple of natural dyers that I know in Palestine are just doing it according to kind of a general knowledge of natural dyeing that you can find today. And the interesting thing is, I mentioned his name is Thomas Abercrombie. Like he's a British, I think, photographer that archived our history. And then there was a travel log that I read one time. I forget the guy's name, but he was also a British traveler. It was like in the mid 19th century, and he traveled all over Palestine. And he did this like really detailed diary documenting everything he saw, like food, tradition, costumes, the landscape. And he had a description of a natural dye house that he visited in Nablus. And that was the only account I could find. I couldn't find anything else. So it's interesting that our history, we're like parsing through the white colonizers' perspective on our own history.
Yeah, for sure. Can you speak to me a little bit more about the oral histories that you've come across and that people have been able to share with you through your research and trying to find weavers that are still working with these traditional looms, and how, oral history as its own form of archiving within the textile world, since, we don't have access to any other records?
Yeah. It's actually interesting. I think there's a frustration often with oral history because it's vulnerable to, it's malleable. I'll say it's malleable. Oral history isn't like a document that you file away and then you pull it out in 100 years and the same exact information has been printed or written on the page. It's malleable. So I read yesterday in Widad Kawar's one of her books. She's I think Palestinian Jordanian archivist of Palestinian dresses, and she'd written a book, or she has loads of books, but in one of them I was reading yesterday, she said that one of the difficulties but also exciting parts of trying to archive embroidery motifs is that the names differ from generation to generation. So what might have been, I don't know, a corn husk to a grandmother becomes a flower to her daughter, becomes a tree to her daughter. And so the same motif it's preserved physically, but then it's changing the name of it, the interpretation of it, the the context or the expression of it, because a particular motif is meant to express something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing with the oral histories that I'm finding in weaving. It's malleable. It's changing based on the historical, economic, social context of the daughter that is keeping it alive at this time. So I'm working with two weavers now, Bil Khalil. One of them is 70 years old, and the other one is in her 50s. And they learn from their mothers, who learn from their mothers, and so on and so forth. And now they're teaching younger women in the village. It's not the same. It's changing. It's malleable. It's based on what they can get. It's limited now. They don't do natural dyeing now. They do chemical dyeing. So that oral history has sort of pushed and pulled. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so deeply human, right? It makes me emotional to think that, again, as time goes on and new generations come along, our history and our language, and in result our textiles and all of these things sort of take new shape and evolve as we do. And I love that you mentioned, embroidery or tatriz, because this is something I'm so fascinated by, and this is such a personal part of your work as well. You've done personalized suits and dresses and outfits for so many people around the world. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking about Aruj Aftab's, beautiful raw silk suit with your handmade tatriz. And I want to go back a little bit because you started your work with textiles because you had a very strong message to communicate. And this is something that we see through tatriz, is all of these motifs, and every single embroidery is communicating a message. It's telling a story. And so I'm curious, how has your relationship with tatriz and embroidery and motifs sort of taken shape as your work has evolved? And if there's anything that you felt you wanted to say through tatriz, that you felt that maybe you needed to create new language for, or if the language was there already and it was just about how you interpreted it and used it. I know that was a sort of hefty question, so.
It's such a good question, though. I love that question because listen, like when I started working with tatriz, I was like, this is pretty, it's handmade, it has meaning, it has weight. Let's just do it.
Mm-hmm.
The more I learn about it, the more cautious I've become, because it's such an intentional practice. And I think like long gone now are my days of like slapping a motif onto a t-shirt. I can't justify it anymore. I can't, because the idea that something would take as long as it does to dye the yarn and then embroider it, and it used to take women, and it still takes women, months to create their dress. It's because it would last her whole life, and then it would be passed down to her daughter, and you didn't have this like level of production and consumerism that we see today. And the more I learn, the more intentional I'm trying to be about the pieces that I'm putting out. Not putting tatriz onto a t-shirt for the sake of putting tatriz onto a t-shirt. لأنه حرام. It's a pity, it's a shame. And one thing I really love is that if you don't know, tatriz, for our listeners, tatriz is, you're not going to find the same motifs in the north as you would in the south, on the coast as you would in the mountains, because it was hyper specific to villages and regions, and it was affected by multiple things, including one thing, the landscape. So you had palm trees in the south, you had the sea on the coast, of course, and you would see, or orange blossoms on the coast if you were in Jaffa, you would see those motifs incorporated, and it was like this art, like this embroidered archive of the landscape. Beautiful. But then the question that I had was like, well, our landscapes change now, right? Like in 2023, Palestinian landscape is not the same as it used to be in the 19th century. The trees that we used to know and love are not there, or they've become like GMO, monoculture. And this is, of course, the doing of our occupation forces. Our landscape now features the apartheid wall, military roadblocks. So the question is, I wonder if we could like update the archive? And is it right to update the archive? Like, should we be archiving the apartheid wall? But I did. I took a leap and I made a garment like a couple months ago, 3-4 months ago now, that had like embroidery of the apartheid wall and then the settlements around it. And then the path that it would take us to get from Ramallah to Bethlehem, because that's where the garment was made. And it was kind of a scary thing to do because I was like, is this wrong? It felt wrong. It felt so difficult to introduce something so evil and into an archive that is so pure in my eyes.
It's you raise very, very, important and heavy questions with regards to this balance of trying to honor this beautiful and pure art form while also honoring your experience and archiving your active history that you're living through. And I really don't think, that there is necessarily a right or a wrong question, because what really it comes down to, which is what you mentioned at the beginning of your answer, is intentionality, right? It's the intention with which you do it and the research that goes into all your work. And something that, at least as someone who has been following your work and learning so much about my own history, our people, is the generosity with which you share the intricacies of every single step that it takes you to create a garment from start to finish. Why is this important to you? Why do you dedicate so much of your work to describing with great detail and care sort of everything that goes into the beautiful garments that people then are able to buy and keep for themselves from you?
Yes, that's true. If you follow Noah's work, you will, whether or not you want to, know all these details because I mean, we live in a world where now if you buy a garment, you really know so little about it. Maybe on the tag, made in insert country here, and that's really about it. You don't know anything else about it, which is wrong because of so many levels. But I think it just creates an opportunity for the maker to short the, not the maker, I'd say designer, to short the makers, right? To potentially underpay them, to contribute to the fact that they may be working in, frankly, just inhumane conditions. You get away with a lot when people don't know the details, don't know the information of how a garment was produced. So the idea is to just be more transparent with who is making this. And, and thinking about the socioeconomic and political framework that they're making it in, I want you to know that someone in a refugee camp has made your blazer. That's something that you should know. Like, why are they in this refugee camp? I want you to know that the women who make this learned it from their mothers and from their grandmothers and are working to keep this alive in the face of the most difficult obstacles. I want you to know that the weavers in Gaza couldn't import their own looms and had to figure out how to make their own because the occupation wouldn't let them import looms. And it also never felt right for me to say, I made this garment, I produced it, I designed it, and this is my work, and that's it. Why are so many people involved in a garment and they don't get the credit for literally bringing it to life? It never felt right to not shed light on the people that spend their time and their energy to produce the pieces that they produce.
This is one of the reasons why, beyond being, an incredible designer and community member, I see you as a teacher, personally, but also, to the larger community that follows you and your work. And I'm curious if you can, if you have, someone that you would consider one of the most influential teachers for you with regards to textile design. And it doesn't have to be a singular person, of course, because as we know, a lot of these practices and this art form happens in community. So I would love to hear from you who has or have been your biggest teachers in this.
Absolutely. I love this question. To give credit where credit is due, I wouldn't be where I am today without the guidance and frankly mothering, I would say, of Vivian Sansour, who I'm sure you know. She is amazing. She is a goddess, like working with seeds, working with the earth. I interned with her when I first came to Palestine 6 or 7 years ago. And we worked on, I helped her with her traveling kitchen at the time.
Can
And this
you
kitchen,
talk a little bit about that kitchen?
it was this kitchen that she'd made. It was so lovely. And it was designed to be deconstructed and reconstructed so that she could put it in her car and take it all over Palestine to different communities, farming communities, and cook with them. She would work with them to use the crops that they were growing, to cook with them, to archive their recipes, to archive the way that they were using their crops, to archive things that otherwise can be erased, you know. She talked often about the purple carrot, the stuffed purple carrot, which, if you say that, no one knows what it is now.
I don't know what that is. Please inform me.
It was mahshi. It was a carrot that was stuffed with meat and then cooked with rice, I think. And she was like, "This is what we used to eat, and now you can't find it, and no one even knows that it exists." And she's like, "This is a part of our community, of our culture that was erased because we lost the seeds." And we lose the seeds for so many reasons, of course, right? Because of land theft, because of the introduction of, like, what do you call it, like Monsanto seeds, GMOs, all this. I mean, it's a really complex and heartbreaking issue. And she's like, when you lose these recipes, you lose the traditions. Like the women, for example, that would sit around carving the carrots out and then stuffing them. You lose that tradition of community and the stories that might have come sitting in that circle to make that dish. She taught me to look to the land as a teacher. She taught me to look to the land as a means for archiving our human experience around it, that's been shaped around it. And I know for a fact that I wouldn't be thinking about the archive and the community the way that I do if I had never met her.
That's so beautiful. I could talk to you for hours on end about all of this and more, but I think that really what it comes down to in all of this is, like you said, our connection to the land, our connection to community, and our dedication to keeping all of the fabrics, no pun intended, that make our society and our lives, present and with us, despite and in spite of everything. Was there anything else that you wanted to share with me today about this or with the people who are listening?
I think, yeah, talking about just one more thing I mentioned at the beginning about Al Majdal village, that when Al Majdal village was depopulated and razed to the ground, we lost the tradition of weaving Majdalawi fabric for decades before it was revived by weavers in the Gaza Strip. And these weavers today have been displaced once again. They have fled, and they are fleeing every day. Their homes and their weaving studios have been destroyed. And when the war first started, and I was checking in, they were like, all we want is just for this to end, and we can go back and we can keep working to preserve our heritage. We can keep working to produce this for the world. And now when I chat with them, all they're doing is trying to survive. And I think this threat of losing our culture is very much alive and well. The keepers of Majdalawi fabric and Majdalawi weaving are threatened. Their very lives are threatened. The knowledge that they have is threatened. The means that they have is threatened. And it's an ongoing struggle to tell the world that we are here, that we exist, that our history is in constant threat of erasure. And so I just wanted to make it clear that it's not something that happened once in 1948 and then it's still alive and well today. So if you're listening and you have a love for fabric and you have a love for these weavers, follow their work and keep supporting them.
Mm-hmm. Our art and our struggle for liberation are intrinsically linked, and this is a vital reminder. Thank you for that, Yasmeen. It's always truly an honor to speak with you and to share with you and to learn from you. So thank you for taking the time today. And I hope that this encourages people to learn more about this art form and about your work, but also about our people and our struggle for survival and beyond survival liberation. So thank you.
Thank you, Habibti, for the beautiful questions. It's always a pleasure.
The pleasure is mine. Take care, Yasmeen.
You too.